Hey, good morning, everybody. I'm Kelly Ryder, and I am here to share some information with you and some ideas with you today about planning a language-rich content lesson. Before we get started, I want to thank Ton and Carol for inviting me. It's a great honor and privilege to be invited to be part of this with you. And I want to thank them for all of their organization that goes into it behind the scenes and making it very easy to help us and work with you. So thank you, Ton and Carol. Okay, so before we jump into the content, I want to give you a little bit of introduction about me. I dedicated the last 25 years to public education across 4 different school systems, but in the public education world, I've had a number of roles, as you can see. I started as an ESL teacher, just in multi-age classroom, K through 3. Just happened that classroom teacher went out on maternity leave, and I loved that class, so I took over as their classroom teacher for a few years. I was a technology specialist, did training around the school system, elementary assistant principal for a few years. Most recently, for 6 years, I was the district coordinator for the ESL program in Anne Arundel County Public Schools here in Annapolis, Maryland. Also, we're a certified trainer, and in the past year have really been focusing on our new adventure, which is English Learner Portal. So I hope that gives you a little information about me so that you know where my background is and where I'm coming from with what I'm going to share with you today. All right, let's get going here. All right, English Learner Portal, as I said, that's our group and who I represent. I hope you'll check us out sometime. Okay, planning a language-rich content lesson. Let's get in. Okay, today I selected the topic of planning a language-rich content lesson for a few reasons. First, if you have an ELD program where you have an ESL teacher who either pulls out or pushes into your classroom or co-teaches, chances are that time together is very limited. In reality, it takes a whole team of teachers all day, every day, to develop language fast enough to ensure our students aren't falling behind. For this presentation, I'm going to walk you through the process we've developed at English Learner Portal that seems to help teachers think through their units and lessons with language in mind for all teachers, so that when we're co-teaching or working with students separately at different times, we can all be on the same page with the same goals. I'm going to use math as our example for today. You can use this planning process for any content area. If you have a moment where you don't see how this would work for your content, just let me know and we can talk that through. I like math examples because there's this myth floating around out there that English learners, math is easy for English learners. They don't need language. You can do math without language. Yeah, let's talk about that after we work through how complicated an example can be. Okay, in this session, I'll model how to determine the language demand within a standard, very briefly. Create a language objective that allows students to express their thinking in math, and then consider what success will look like at different English proficiency levels. Okay, let's jump in. Here's a template for the planner I like to use for the content areas. You can find a copy of this template and other templates we use in our free resource center at the website listed there, englishlearnerportal.teachable.com. A few different planners for general content lessons, read aloud, small group reading, a few different to see which one would work for you. As you can see, this isn't a lesson planner exactly. All right, this step comes before planning a lesson. In this step, you think through what exactly you want your students to know and be able to do, and the language they will need to do this. Then you can take that information and begin building your lesson plans. When I plan, I like to have some tools on hand that help me remember what I can expect from students at each proficiency level. So before I sit down with my colleagues, I want to make sure if you're part of the WIDA consortium, you have your performance definitions, your can-do descriptors. If you're from Ohio, you have your English language development standards. For whatever your state uses, you have some kind of standards floating around out there and some tools that would help you. If you aren't sure, you can send me a note. I'd be happy to help you figure that out and research that, or you can contact your local ESL coordinators or ESL teachers in your building. I'm sure they can steer you in the right direction also. I think I may have missed clicking a button, so now you should be able to see what I'm doing here. I also like to have a resource on hand that helps me determine the language function and some suggestions to go with it. My favorite is the Academic Language Function Toolkit from the Sweetwater School District. It's full of sample language and organizers for each language function. Okay? Okay, we are ready to go. I need to teach this math standard to my students. Adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing decimals. There's a ton to do within that strand. So let me narrow it down to my objective for the next few days. We've practiced working on decimals with all 4 operations, and I believe my students can determine which operation they need based on the problem presented. I want to do a final check on their ability to find the solution and explain how to get that solution. My objective is I can add, subtract, multiply, and divide decimals to hundreds using what I have learned about place value. Based on the objective, I know I will want students to explain and justify. So I'm going to put that there in my language function box. Explain and justify. It's important to note what language function you want students to use, because then you'll be consistent throughout your planning and your lessons to always check back and make sure they really are still explaining, that a proficiency level 1 is still justifying somehow. Okay, we've done some work around this type of problem already, but I may need to keep going back and building the background knowledge for students who aren't quite there yet. Creating a human place value chart using blocks should help. Just a little bit more hands-on for those who aren't quite there yet, and to work through some more practice before we get to the final part. Okay, what exactly is this going to look like in my lesson? So here's our problem for tomorrow. I'm hoping students remember the strategies we use to solve this type of problem. Carla bought 3 pounds of grapes. Each pound of grapes cost $2.75. How much money did Carla spend on grapes? Solve and be sure to explain your reasoning. I'm pretty sure they can solve it. I know we will need to work on the explain your reasoning part. The students may draw to help them solve the problem. Okay, they may also choose repeated addition or multiplication. Now, here's the part I think we often forget that is crucial. We like to call this know your 6, okay, as in proficiency level 6, or the model response, what a native speaker would say or do. In other words, what is it that you want students to say or write? What do you consider the right answer or a great response? Right? We often don't take time to work this out, and that leaves us and students kind of shooting in the dark to meet our expectations, and leaves us frustrated that it's not all coming together the way we'd like. You know, when you look at that paper and you're like, ah, I know they know how to do this. Why didn't they write that down? Well, first we need to know exactly what we want from them, and then we can get them there. If this was a language arts or science lesson, I would do the same thing. What do I want students to ultimately be able to say, write, or comprehend in this lesson? So for this problem, here is my model response. I'll give you a moment to look it over. Okay, so Carla and her grapes here. This is pretty complicated. I'm going to expect this in both writing and speaking, with speaking coming first and writing being the last step as we take over a few days. This is not a one-day deal here. Oral language is a powerful scaffold and support for written language. So taking time to talk through thinking is never a waste. Once I have thought this through, I can determine my 3 levels of language: vocabulary, sentence structures, grammar. Okay. Here's the vocabulary I need to make sure everyone can use both in speaking and writing. It's pretty technical. Again, no one speaks math as a native language. I also want students to be able to use sequencing words when they are explaining their thinking. This is a skill that can be used throughout the day, so definitely worth a mention. I also see that the students will need to work on more complex sentence structures. That's good because that's a good goal heading towards the upper levels of proficiency. And I see some past tense endings and some ing in here. It also makes me think that those past tense endings and ing, when we do our small group reading, those are the pieces my students often miss when reading across a word. They drop off the end. So I need to make a note to myself that when I work on this in math, we're going to practice reading all the way across those words. And then when I do my small group reading, we're going to work on that same skill with those students so we can have some consistency all day. Okay, here's where we are so far. I have my content objective, my language functions. In my model response, we explained and justified. I know what I'm going to do to build background knowledge and keep that going. Okay. So now is where I start thinking about the students I have in front of me and how I will differentiate my expectations and their language goals. I certainly don't expect my level 1 proficiency students, my beginners, to come up with this model response right away. So what is my 1? What does that look like? What's my 3? Okay. At the bottom of the template, you will be adjusting goals based on proficiency level. So we will get to that in a moment. Just remember, every student should still be explaining and justifying and completing grade level math. It just may look different and sound different. So I saved my language objective till after I go through all of that because I really want to be practical and say, this is what I have to do to create this response. So my language objectives will be that I can orally explain and justify my reasoning using first, next, then, and finally. So I decided to pick the sequencing words because those are going to come into play in our language arts classroom. We can use them in science because we have some things coming up about life cycles. It's just real high utility words, and I want to hit that as many times a day as I can. I can justify my product in writing using tenths, hundredths, and thousandths. I can't even say those words, so I sympathize with the students on that one. So this is hitting our academic vocabulary. I want to make sure they're using the right vocabulary, sounding like mathematicians. And I think of all those different things we mentioned, I'm going to focus in on past tense with my students. I can also follow up on that in Writer's Workshop and make sure that my next writing prompt, my next writing assignment would be something where they need to use the past. Okay, past tense. Also, that's going to tie back to my small group reading where I'm reading through the word. So I'm kind of loving this already. Even though I'm planning math, I'm pretty much planning 5 different things at the same time. Okay, now we know our language objective. I mentioned before the bottom of the template. So down at the bottom of the template, we have our chart here. Give you a second to look that over. The bottom of the template helps me organize my differentiation. So I can be prepared to move up and down the continuum as students are responding and in their conversation, as they're interacting. This doesn't necessarily mean that because there's a proficiency level 1 student right in front of me, this is all they're going to do. This gives me a general idea. I can prepare the frames ahead of time. It helps me know how to set the stage for their interaction. But absolutely, I am always going to be going up the level. And if a student, proficiency level 1 or student, is knocking out the first, next, finally, and they're getting the words down, then of course, you know, I'm going to keep adding in the because. How do you know? But this chart helps me be ready to say, if I'm working with someone and they're getting it, what's the next step? Because I always want to be pushing up, always pushing up. I can have all of this prepared ahead of time. I'm thinking, if it happens to come up, I can throw in, I reminded myself to throw in those ED and ING endings, things like that. And it's all right there to remind me. This is also very helpful when you are co-planning or team planning and you're working with students at different times of the day as co-teachers or just teachers who share the same students. If you're all working from the same chart with the same content and language objectives, then you know that students are getting it consistently all day long, and everyone's going to be on the lookout for those things, and it becomes a much more focused and targeted approach and very consistent for students across the day. Okay, now we're going to need some supports in place because our students are all over the place in their language and math levels. So I want to think about how I might support them. I know one thing we're going to have to do a lot of is the academic conversations, academic discussions. I know there are other folks in Virtual today presenting on those topics, so I highly recommend checking those out because I think they'll go very well with what we're talking about here. Before I can get my students to the point to produce this beautiful model response or something similar to it, in writing, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about it. The connection between oral language and written language is so strong that you really need to spend that time up front. I also added in at the bottom there that illustrating the process. I mean, illustrating the process is good for all students, no matter what your English proficiency level is. Showing your thinking, whether it's through words or pictures, is a very valuable step. I put it under the 1-2 column because as I was working through this with my team of teachers, we realized that we had created the level 1-2 frames so that our students were explaining but they weren't justifying. And we've said all along, explain and justify, explain and justify. Make sure everyone is doing that. So we added in illustrating there to remind ourselves that we can have our beginners justify their answers through their illustrations, and then we can start to help them add words to that. All right, so let's look at, right, here's our more completed chart. If you look across the bottom, here are some of the supports I'm thinking of. I know we're going to need place value charts, different visuals, so that students can keep it straight. All students, not just English learners, the difference between tens and hundreds and tenths and hundredths. Pretty complicated, and it's hard to hear that difference unless you really enunciate it. So I want to have some visuals ready with place value charts and things that I can put up and point to as I go to make sure they're seeing the difference between the words as I use them. As we talked about before, my sentence frames, I'll have them ready for different levels. I may assign hand sentence frames on sentence strips to certain students based on their level. I may just put different ones up in front and let them decide which ones they use. Depends on where I am in the process. As you know, I'd start much more guided in the beginning, and then each day as we work through this unit, I would pull back some of those supports. All right, for our sensory supports, I want to have, I can take out my play money, my coins, some place value blocks that we can work on. I think we have some mats, some laminated mats where students can build those circles that we showed earlier in the presentation, where they can show the repeated addition. I want to break all of that out for them. Being able to put the hands-on things in front of you and talk it through first will lead to better written responses in the end. Okay, now our interactive supports. As I said earlier, I'm going to do a lot of partner work, a lot of sharing, a lot of small group, a lot of those academic conversation things that you saw, that you'll see in other Virtual presentations. Also for math, Stanford's collaborative conversations or constructive conversations, perfect for math, a great course. The MOOC that's online, I've learned a ton from them about using academic conversations in math. All right, so there's our planner. Now, like we said, it's not necessarily a lesson planner, but it's a great tool for collaborative planning, so that now as each of the teachers from my team goes off, whether it be the reading intervention teacher, the classroom teacher, the ESL teacher, the PE teacher, the music teacher, whoever may be, you can share this planner and say, this is what we're working on over the next 3 days, 5 days, 2 weeks, whatever it is. And any way you can support these ideas would be much appreciated. Then you all leave on the same page, and it can turn into individual lesson plans where you're building in those interactive and sensory supports each day leading up to your final beautiful model response, where we're all on the same page and students know what you want from them, and they take all their words and put it into writing. So our time is about up. I hope that this was helpful to you. If you have any questions, if you start working on this and you get stuck and you need some ideas or something doesn't make sense, feel free, send me a note anytime, info@englishlearnerportal.com. And I greatly appreciate, again, having the opportunity to talk to you today, and reach out anytime. But thank you. Thank you for being here.